So I'm very excited to be here. For those who don't know me, my name is Vincent Del Casino. I'm the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs here. And it's very exciting to have our first speaker this year in our University Scholars Series. Dr. Saili. You practice things like 9 times and you walk in a room and you mess it up. Kulkarni is from the College of Education, and she's doing some really exciting work at the intersections of disability and race. And for those who are interested in this sort of topic, the kind of intersections that we're thinking about are spaces where critical race theory and disability studies come together to really ask some important questions about what educational spaces look like. I was actually reading her one of her recent articles this morning, which is kind of an overall study of the intersections of race and disability studies and the ways in which we don't always unpack effectively the kind of categories of Asian and Asian American in the concept of disability and so forth. These are critical questions as we move forward and think about the future of K-12 education, but also the expansion into higher ed. So it's really exciting to have an expert of her caliber here today. And with that, I want to welcome her to the stage to give her talk, Understanding Intersections of Disability and Race, PK-12 Education, Justice Studies, and Higher Education.
I'm a little shorter, so I'm going to put this down. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Wow, what an overwhelming crowd. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, all right. So thank you to Provost Del Casino for the introduction. Thank you to the library, especially Leslie Sechrist and the rest of the staff who's been helping to put these University Scholar Series on. And thank you to all of you for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about my work, my research, and hope to engage during the discussion with all of you. You'll notice in my talk right away that there's a slash in the word disability. And I can speak a little bit more to that during the discussion, but I would like to say that that slash is meant to highlight a fracture in the field, a fracture that looks at the social constructions of that identity of disability, and to also look at how disability is perceived by individuals, how people in society treat people with disabilities. So there's the disability there because of that language and that fracture. Thank you, Leslie. So we can speak a little bit more about the disability terminology, but I will get going with my talk. So as Provost Del Casino said, I'm going to be talking about the understanding of the intersections of disability and race. I'm also going to be looking at the implications of this work for PK-12 education, as well as justice studies, and then implications for us as folks in higher education, part of the CSUs. So this is just a little bit about my sort of linear trajectory into the field. So just as any good qualitative researcher will tell you, you have to think about your positionality, your reflexivity, what you bring and how you bring things to the work. Right? And so I got started as an Oakland Unified special education teacher several years ago, and that's how I sort of entered into this field of special education. I went on to get my master's and my doctorate at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then I got my first faculty job at another Cal State, Dominguez Hills, for those of you who are familiar with Southern California. And then I ended up here at San Jose State. And so although this looks really nice when it's linear, we all know that it's not that simple, right? So we know that trajectories are fairly seldomly linear, right? And those directional changes and those bumps in the road are what make us who we are, right? And so I wanted to just highlight a couple of those bumps for myself. The first of which was that I was a multicultural program coordinator. So I actually worked with the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion as a grad student in my doctoral program. And that opportunity really gave me an opportunity to learn about first-generation students, sense of belonging on campus, and how to support students of color in a grad program and a grad space. And then I also, during grad school, got diagnosed with hypothyroidism. And that changed my outlook a lot because I saw the world as a fairly able-bodied, healthy person. And then when hypothyroidism was diagnosed, I started to shift my perspective and think about, what we think about as invisible disabilities or invisible health conditions and how those affect people. And so I started to gain a little bit more, I think, perspective or insight into what it might be to be disabled or to be someone with an autoimmune or chronic health disorder. I also worked in grad school as a community inclusion volunteer, so I supported adults, much older adults, who had significant disabilities in a program in Portland. And a lot of what I learned from that program was that a lot of them went through a very segregated instructional program leading up to that community inclusion program that they were in. And so a lot of them were part of a product of a system where they may have not even really had access to meaningful instruction. And that's important for us to think about when we think about people with disabilities and what, sort of counts as meaningful for them. But I wanted to highlight two areas of study that really informed my dissertation and the work that followed and this work on race and disability. And that is, I had the opportunity to take classes in what's called culturally relevant pedagogy at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I worked with a faculty member named Dr. Ladson-Billings, Gloria Ladson-Billings, and she really opened my eyes to that field and that area of study. And then I also worked with Dr. Eunjung Kim, who really opened my eyes to the world of disability studies and how we need to enhance the voices of people who actually have disabilities and their perspectives in the work. So today's talk will talk about two studies that inform some of this work and then the implications for them. And so what you'll see on the right side is a study that is informed by a theoretical framework called Disability Studies and Critical Race Theory, or DISCRIT for short, and is also informed by teachers' beliefs as well as teachers of color and the beliefs and perspectives that they bring. I will also try to get into a little bit of the study, which was a restorative justice study for elementary school teachers in the Bay Area. And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about learning labs, which is a new piece of work that I'm starting. So the first study then asked these questions. So I was looking at special education teachers of color, and I asked first, how did they develop beliefs? And specifically, how did they develop beliefs that then positioned them through their experiences, right, of being students in a PK-12 system, but then also as teachers in their own classrooms? And then I also looked at how their beliefs either positioned them to dismantle or perpetuate racism and ableism in schools. Now, the second study was sort of the classroom side of things. So I was looking more at the practical aspects. And I looked at how teachers who are now in schools or working with students looked at restorative justice concepts. So how are they using these concepts? How are they using these practices for teachers of color, using them in elementary school settings, elementary school classrooms? And I wanted to know, how are they implementing those practices with students who have and don't have disabilities, students of color, and those intersections of those two identities. So I'll start by talking about DISCRIT, or Disability Studies and Critical Race Theory. Disability studies and critical race theory has 7 main tenets, but the crux of all of those tenets is that racism and ableism are interdependent. And you can see this in a variety of areas or fields of study that are sort of subfields of that, such as overrepresentation. So overrepresentation in our field has been a really large problem since the 1960s and 70s. We overrepresent Black and brown students of color in special education much more frequently than we do white students. And that has been a pervasive problem in our field, and DISCRIT has changed the way that we think about or perceive that problem. Instead of looking at, well, what's wrong with the kid, what's the deficit within the child, we're thinking about what are the practices, what are the implications of the things that we do as educators, as practitioners, that then inform that. The other implication of DISCRIT would be things like the school-to-prison nexus. You'll notice that I use nexus instead of pipeline. And that's because going from school to prison is seldom a linear process, right? It is complex. It involves multiple systems acting with that child who then ends up there. I will talk a little bit more about this concept of smartness and goodness, but what I'll say is that smartness and goodness is this idea that we position students from the get-go when they are in schools in certain ways, in which they are thought of as smart or not smart, good or bad, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about that and the piece about discipline and behavior. Who gets the punishments that tend to be zero tolerance types of punishments, right? Who gets sent out of the classroom? Who gets the timeouts? Who gets suspended or expelled, right? And then I'll also talk a little bit about this last piece, which is access to resources. Who gets access to the best resources, the best classrooms, the best teachers, the best schools? And finally, who's represented in our research? Who is the sample? Who is the population of students that we are serving? So the reason I chose teachers of color and the reason that this is important is because often we know that teachers of color are either undervalued or ignored in terms of teacher education. Most of our focus in the research, unfortunately, has always been on white teachers because they make up the majority. But it is still important that we learn from the voices of teachers of color. And not being valued as teachers of color can contribute to things like attrition from credential granting programs. Many of the teachers of color that we see entering the field tend to be focused on equity and justice, but we aren't fostering or nurturing or listening to teachers in ways where we can help them to foster that in their K-12 classrooms. What we have learned is that just because a teacher is a teacher of color doesn't mean they're automatically going to be critically conscious. That has to be nurtured, that has to be fostered in classrooms. And going along with that, we know that teachers' beliefs, what they believe about their students, what they believe about instructional practices, what they believe about students of color and students with disabilities, is directly tied into the types of actions that they take for those students. Right? And so in addition to informing things like future actions, teachers are also shaped by these two big areas, their teacher education programs, as well as their own school experiences, how they perceive their experiences going through school. And so then it is up to us as teacher educators, as people who are preparing future teachers, to help teachers to reflect, to interrogate, and to help them understand their positionings. So as I said, I use a sub-framework of disability studies and critical race theory called smartness and goodness. And so I define goodness and smartness by adapting Broderick and Leonardo's definition as it's a performative, cultural, ideological system that constructs normal schooling experiences. They highlight how goodness can be an ideology or a set of beliefs, but it can also be material practices that we employ to empower or disempower youth. Hutt also uses the term smartness as a social construct rather than biological. So when we think about intelligence as a biological construct, Hutt actually says, no, it is a social positioning or a social construct of how we construct students in classrooms. And so we've seen through their work how students are positioned with this framework of smartness and goodness. And what we can also see is that teachers then can be positioned in these ways too. And that's where the work of teacher education becomes very, very critical. And so an example of this from a novel that highlights the perspectives of students of color and students with learning disabilities is this quote here by one of the participants. "The quiet ones may not pass the test, but they're good boys, so the teachers let them pass." So thinking again about that positioning of the student, right, as good and then smart. And so as I showed you before with my research questions, the goal or the aim was to redesign, to reframe some of the ways in which we show or support teachers in a special education, teacher education program. And so, again, I was looking at those positionings of those teachers of color in PK-12 schools, as well as in their classrooms when they become teachers, and then their positionings and how those perpetuate or dismantle ableism and racism. And so what I did was to actually take course material and map with the discrete tenets to reframe the courses that I was teaching. And this was back in 2016 that I did that. And so I actually created a set of engagement materials, scouring through what we have in our fields of disability studies and education, and special education, and teacher education, to create a set of activities and meaningful engagement tools for teacher education candidates. And so I highlighted those tenets, the second of which was troubling this idea of there's a singular identity. So we're not somebody with a disability separate from we being somebody who is a person of color. Those identities intersect and interact with each other to inform our experiences. And so these texts and these engagement materials were set up to highlight some of those experiences. So for example, the quote that I shared with you earlier was from David Connor's book, Urban Narratives, and that actually highlights what students with learning disabilities in high school who are students of color actually experienced in education. And so the second one here, looking at sort of the psychological impacts of being labeled, having a disability, I used a couple of examples such as the Harriet Tubman Collective, that Facebook link that you see there, which talks about this idea that we sometimes miss the label of disability when we talk about things like police brutality. So we talk about the race of the individual, but we don't talk about a lot of them having a disability, and many of them did. So for that first study, I then took participants who were part of those classes, who engaged with those materials that centered race and ability, and I worked with them to collect data. And those 3 participants were all self-identified as teachers of color and working in different school spaces. And so the data for this study, again, was qualitative, and so we used a series of weekly class reflections that were very broadly defined, as well as long reflections, which may have been a topic specific. So it may have dealt with that idea of social construction of intelligence, what does it mean to use restorative versus zero tolerance practices with behavior. And then we also did a series of semi-structured interviews with those folks to understand how their beliefs have shifted or changed over time. And I won't talk too much about the analysis process, but the idea was to create a set of counter stories, or stories that counter existing narratives. And so the coding process for this really highlighted the ideas of their experiences, their beliefs, and then tried to theme using, again, that positioning of smartness and goodness to create stories. And so I want to spend more of my time actually sharing some of those stories with you. So this was one of the participants from the first study, and her name was Lena. Lena was a Black female in her mid-30s. She was serving in an urban preschool education program, and that program served students both with disabilities and without disabilities. As a student, one of the reflections that she'll provide was actually from her preschool experiences herself. And so she talked a lot about being in preschool, a private religious preschool in Southern California, and in an area that experienced what we know of as redlining or white flight, right? And so she talked about being a preschool teacher of color in a mostly Black preschool, and even that this majority Black space, there was that emphasis on goodness over smartness. And so here's a quote from Lena during the early process of thinking about your background and experiences of education itself. So I'll read the quote out, and then I've highlighted a couple of the key areas that helped us to think about some of her positioning in that space. the whole class, my whole class, excuse me, we'd have lined up and everybody gets a SWAT. And she, the nun, was doing the SWAT. I felt it was very unfair. Everybody didn't get one, and I didn't understand what her reasoning was. And I remember one student in particular. I remember the girl's name was Misty. She was African American. I'm African American. The nun was African American. And she got to her and said, well, I know that you didn't yell out when the assembly went on, pretty much, and kind of let her go on. So I start with that intro to say, you know, I got the SWAT, and I didn't really know the nun from here or there. I didn't really spend time with her. But for me, it was one of the earliest experiences that started off, you know, the feeling of like, whatever happens at school, hey, you just go along with it. You're a part of it. You don't oppose it. You know, that type of thinking. And so what we can start to see in Lena's experiences in preschool is that this priority was on compliance and order, right? And that compliance and order then position her or doesn't position her, right, in terms of goodness, right? Who's good in the classroom? The kid who doesn't yell, the kid who doesn't cry out, the kid who isn't loud, right? And so that's Lena's experience with preschool. And then this was a reflection from class later on in the year where we could see a little bit about how Lena reflects on things that then will affect her students in preschool. So she says, for years, I've been aware of mass stereotyping, that this is happening every day and all around me. Through the years, stereotyping had affected the quality of life for me. I still struggle to unlearn what I've been programmed to be. As an adult, I have learned self-advocacy and gained the ability to adjust my attitude or filter out what is real or false, most of the time. A child, however, whom has no idea about stereotypes or media imagery, is often forced to engage with and be programmed with ideas of these projected stereotypes. Even more, when we think about children and adults with disabilities, what protection do they really have from system-wide reinforcing of stereotypes? And so what Lena tried to do in her experiences teaching preschool was to bring in those ideas of consciousness or a double consciousness, right? This idea that she was perceiving things from a way where she had to continuously reframe, right? And that really, I think, is a better positioning of her as smart and good, right? Having to constantly renegotiate for her students. And so I use this quote by W.E.B. Du Bois, that double consciousness, it's a peculiar sensation, a double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. And that's precisely what Lena had to do, was to keep reframing and recentering for her students. And so then after this study concluded, I started to think about, could we start even earlier? Could we start with students who are young and really getting them to understand some of these complex ideas? And so the restorative justice study then came out of those ideas from this previous study. And so for those who aren't familiar with it, restorative justice is more about retroactively repairing harm in the classroom. So moving away from some of what I talked about before, the zero tolerance, harsh punishment, or disciplinary measures. So defining misbehavior as harm done to others and then working to create like a restitution or restoration of that relationship or process is what restorative justice is focused on. And so we started thinking, me and a grad student of mine, about where was this being employed, where was this being used, and where was it effective? And we started to see a pattern where a lot of secondary schools were using restorative justice in meaningful and effective ways. And we thought about this idea of, could we start even earlier? Could we use restorative practices with younger kids and teachers of those younger kids? And so that led us into this idea of, what concepts and practices teachers of color in elementary classrooms were using. And then are they implementing them with students with and without disabilities, students of color, and then students at those intersections of those social identities? And so we worked with 3 teachers here in the Bay Area who identified as teachers of color and who had students with or without disabilities and were using some of those restorative practices in their classrooms. And so the data collection for this process included a series of monthly interviews with these teachers, and then we asked them to reflect on their practices through a series of monthly journal entries. So they had to document their use of the practices. And while we weren't able to get permission to go into their classroom as researchers, we were able to get permission to have them audio record some of the interactions that they had with their students. And so I will say that this data is still being analyzed. We collected and completed last summer, so there's still a little bit more to go. But I'm, looking forward to the conversation about what we've found so far. We had 3 participants who were all identifying as female and teachers of color, and had various levels of experience in the classroom, but taught young students, kindergarten, 2nd, and 3rd grade. And so an early sample of some of the things that we're finding, our 3rd participant, who is a special education teacher, 2nd and 3rd grade, she worked in a public elementary school and thought of, instead of us using a scripted set of practices that are called restorative justice practices, we should be using it as a lens with which to highlight our entire, way of teaching, our way of communicating with students, our way of building community in the classroom. And so she really thought of it more as a lens with which to guide her practice. And she believed that even young children could be made aware of some of these differences and already picked up on some of those nuances. And so she brings up this story here to kind of highlight that. She said, it's funny how kids are aware about differences. One of my students, who, while we were reading a book called The Little Black Dog, says, "Why are all the animals black?" And I was like, "I don't know." And he says, "And why are all the kids white?" And so even then, the student, a 2nd or 3rd grade student, is picking up on a couple of those nuances. And so we are thinking about then patterns of how, students, even at a young age, can be start to be made aware of those differences. And while we haven't completed the study, what we're finding is that this piece about accessibility of restorative justice is starting to become a little bit complicated. So we noticed that the elementary school teachers who weren't special ed teachers had a difficult time saying how they found ways to incorporate students with disabilities into restorative practices. And so it's being teased out now that just the only participant who taught special education was the one who was meaningfully employing practices with students who had disabilities at that intersection. And so I'll just go ahead and talk a little bit about the expansion of the work. And so the earlier work then sort of informed the work on restorative justice. So that work was with elementary school teachers in Bay Area districts. The next study is actually working with more stakeholders. So instead of just being teachers, we're looking to see what the perspectives of family members are, what the perspectives of administrative positions are, and teachers as well, and how we can bring all of those stakeholders in schools together to inform decisions about things like discipline and behavior. And the last is a study that's going to start this spring, which I'm really excited about. It's a critical affinity group of special education teachers of color. So they will be brought in from different Cal State programs throughout the Cal States, and we will be creating a space or an affinity group for them to deconstruct some of these issues around racism and ableism, and to really get an opportunity to build a network of support around those 2 areas. And so then what are the implications then for students and faculty, and in particular for faculty here at the Cal States? So what can we as faculty do to provide our students here on campus with meaningful, accessible, and equitable instruction? There's a couple of things. The first of which is to really think about or learn from their histories and backgrounds, and to think about and reflect and interrogate what kinds of practices are we using in our instruction? Who is being served? Who is served and who is this a disservice for? Who is being centered in this instruction and who is being marginalized? And to be able to interrogate and ask those questions, who's successful, who's not successful, how are we defining success in our classrooms, is an important piece. And then thinking about just even the way we assign things, right? So our readings, our assignments, our curricula, who is being represented in all of those spaces and who is not? And then also thinking about our research and our scholarship. Who is being included in our samples and who's not? So I draw from an article that we wrote in 2017 about how in communication device use, we saw that the majority of studies were still on middle-class white English speakers, and that there are a lot of people who use communication devices that don't come from that sample. And so it is important to highlight or to notice that there are voices of others who are missing. And then what about our standards of practice and where do they originate? So having those interrogative moments or those questionings about some of this will lead, I believe, to greater and more meaningful instruction for our students and meaningful scholarship that we put out there. And the last thing that I'll just say is, as any good teacher will do, give you some homework, right? So no, this isn't homework, but these are some really critical, I think, readings that highlight some of these intersections that I've been talking about. And so I mentioned, I think, before David Connor's book, Urban Narratives, but there's also quite a bit of amazing work being done. Subini Anama, one of the folks who helped develop the Discrit framework, has a new book out called Pedagogy of Pathologization, which talks about girls of color in the juvenile justice system. I actually just got to meet Haben Girma this past weekend, and she's really amazing. She's a deafblind woman, Eritrean American, and has a lot of really cool things to say in her book, personal narrative and perspective. As well as some folks who are working in teacher education to dismantle these ideas of racism and ableism. This last book that I have up there in the gray is actually one where I have a chapter on some of the like more nuanced pieces of how I restructured and reframed my own courses to include some of those disability and race perspectives. So that is it from me. This is my contact information in case you are ever a social media person or would like to email me. Thank you very much.
All right, that was awesome and unbelievably well timed, by the way. Knocked it out of the park. She did all that in half an hour, and I think I learned more than I've learned in a long time, so thank you. So we have time for questions, so let me turn it back to Dr. Kulkarni and see if there are questions from the audience that you could jump in on. We got 12 minutes for that.
Awesome. Yes, go for it.
You're a researcher and a teacher.
Uh-huh.
And I know this focused more on earlier grade levels. I said you're a teacher and a researcher, and this focused on earlier education. But do you feel that you can implement what you research with your own students here at San Jose State?
Yes, and I do. All of the things that I've talked about doing previously, the studies which included like kind of recentering or reframing race and disability in the classroom, are things that I do in my classes here that I teach at San Jose State as well, and continue to try to reframe and rethink, some of the practices that I employ. So constantly reflecting on and interrogating my own practices, definitely.
Oh. Hi. So I had a question about I want to hear a little more about how the teachers you teach go in and use these in the classroom. So I enjoyed that example of the little boy saying, why are all the dogs, the animals black and the kids white? But that originated with him. So what are some of the strategies that the pre-service teachers or active teachers you work with do to kind of encourage these conversations among young children?
I think, the biggest piece, I think, for them first and foremost is to create a community where they have access to other folks who are doing similar work, and so that they can sort of build together. But in the classroom, as far as that goes, I think, some of the same things I was saying for higher education apply to them as well, right?
Exactly.
To build in opportunities for students to share their histories, to share their background. I talk a lot in my classes about not just like going for the mandated home visit, but to go often to make sure that they're a part of the community, to make sure that they learn a little bit, even if they're not a fluent speaker of a second language that a student may bring in, to learn about that language, to try to be as much, sort of present in what that student comes in with, the community cultural wealth. So those are a couple of things, just that's to be aware of who the student is. Yeah.
Thanks.
Other things.
Hello, thank you for your talk. And I had a question regarding what you consider disability. I thought that special education, they usually just worked with learning disabilities versus medical disabilities. You mentioned the hypothyroidism, and I had never thought of that as being a disability. How do you determine that, and is there a section that you research more than other, the different disabilities?
That's a great question, and there are some special educators in the room too. We have, I mean, officially, right, legally 13 categories of disability that are served under IDEA, and then we have those categories served within school systems. However, my research has focused a little bit more on some of those subjective labels, such as learning disabilities, emotionally, behaviorally disturbed, some of those labels that we tend to perpetuate on Black and Brown students more frequently than we do on other categories of or groups. There are, medical disabilities, and as far as me, like I don't consider it as a disability as part of that 13 categories quite, but like at the same time, I think it informs my experience of sort of the difference of having that chronic health condition. So it is a little bit complex, and I don't think that, I would qualify under the 13 categories quite like that, but yeah.
Thanks again for the talk. So when we think about kind of the intersectionalities that emerge around disability as a set of identity politics as well, and the ways in which it kind of crashes into and it reinforms race and so forth, how is disability, as a set of categories and practices kind of intersecting with some of the critical race theory? The critical disabilities folks are really, asking the question of how we organize, how we think about things. So there's some really interesting work there, and then, what that looks like relative to kind of critical race work.
Mm-hmm. And that was what was highlighted, I think, through the Disability Studies Critical Race Theory framework, the DISCRIT. That was the intent, was to seek to highlight the fact that although we have this great framework of critical race theory, we are missing, right, the experiences, the perspectives of people who have disabilities as part of that framework, and all the ways in which race and disability tend to intersect with each other. And so if we think about, just in society, I, gave the example of, police brutality, right? We see a lot on the news about, Black and brown folks who are being brutalized, unfortunately, by the police, but we tend not to talk about the fact that many of them have learning disabilities as part of their identities. That seems to be missing from the picture. And so those are examples of, how we aren't engaging necessarily the disability identity in meaningful ways. And so the idea with some of this work is to then try to bring in those perspectives of folks who are people with disabilities. The critical affinity group that I'm actually starting in the spring will highlight the perspectives not only of teachers of color, but teachers of color who identify with disabilities. So I'm really excited about kind of bringing in that second perspective. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. One of the things I appreciate so much about the restorative approaches to teaching and learning is that it's focused on a constructive approach rather than a punitive approach. And I'm wondering about how we might transfer that to higher education settings where we are framing this smart, not smart, good, that whole dichotomy, and where what's valued oftentimes is those who are just compliant and, doing the right thing, but not pushing back and trying to improve our systems. And so what your talk reminded me of was this hilarious cartoon. Your talk did not remind me of anything hilarious. It was actually excellent. But it reminded me of a cartoon of a testing situation in a classroom where a little boy was asking the question, this test question doesn't seem fair. And then in the next frame of it, like a machine comes and swooshes him away. Like, you can't ask those kinds of questions, right? And so what can we do to have maybe restorative approaches or constructive approaches within higher education cultures where there can be space to push back or to question the language that we use about kids. I mean, there's a lot right now about where we're labeling students as either at risk or not at risk and things like that. So any ideas about how we might transfer some of these constructive, productive cultures into higher ed?
Yeah, and I think about that constantly because it is something that we see in higher ed as well, right? We see it in K-12, but we also see it in higher ed. And I think, one of the big things is to have conversations like this or to have spaces where faculty and staff can engage, right? So, our college, for instance, is doing the 2 book clubs, and I think that those provide some of those spaces to really sort of unpack some of what we've started to think about as, who is the good kid in your college classroom, who is the smart kid in your college classroom, who's the most prepared, right? And we talk about, we use some of that language, right, around higher ed that needs to be reframed, right? Who's the kid who, what do we do about all those first generation kids, right? Instead of saying that, what are those kids bringing in that we can then work with and support, right? Yeah.
And it might also extend to the way that we view faculty as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Do we have one more question? All right, so what's going to happen now is we're going to do a task force on taking restorative justice framework and evaluating all our policies in the university, and we're going to rewrite all the messages that come through PeopleSoft to students so that they actually feel like they belong here, as opposed to feeling like they have a punitive system. I'm dead serious. You're in trouble. You got a new job now. So let's all thank Saili for an absolutely outstanding talk. And we'll see you at the next event next month. So thank you so much.